Hey everyone, welcome back to the Get More Ministries YouTube channel. And this video and this series is specifically dedicated to understanding how each book of the Bible propels the biblical narrative forward. So, what do we mean by that? Well, each book of the Bible isn't just an isolated book that talks about, specific events for no reason. They're all linked together and they all work together to propel God's history and his redemptive history forward. So this video is specifically about the book of Judges and how that ties in with what came before it and how it sets us up for what's going to come after it. So let's share the screen and get into it. And the first thing that we've got to kind of realize about Judges is that it's a weird book. And it's kind of one of the first books that we get to in the Old Testament that can feel very disjointed and can feel kind of like, what's going on? Like, is this in chronological order? What's going on? It's fairly intense, and you can kind of wake up in the middle of the book and wonder what exactly is going on. So we have a couple things that we want to just talk about the book of Judges in general before we dive in to how it links in with this biblical narrative. So the first thing we've got to realize is that the book of Judges is not chronologically organized. So we do not go on a linear walk through time. It's not a linear chronological order from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. It's actually organized into three sections. And so the first section is the incomplete conquest of the Promised Land. The second section is the cycle of the Judges. And then the third section is the depravity of Israel. So that's actually how the book is organized. So the incomplete conquest of the Judges, that goes, I think, from chapters 1 through 3, maybe chapters 1 through 2. And then you actually have the cycle of the Judges where you get to the actual all of the Judges. And that runs until the end of the Samson narrative in chapter 17, I want to say. Let me check my outline. Through chapter 16. And then 17 through 21 is actually describing the level of depravity within the nation of Israel. And so some of the events of 17 through 21, those are probably occurring within the timeline of the Judges, that second section. So it's not a linear progression of time. So that's kind of the first thing we've got to realize, is that the book of Judges feels disjointed in a sense because that's how the ancient people chronicled history. They didn't necessarily go, this is what happened at the very beginning, and, yada, 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 yada. They would kind of organize it by event. And so you would have this section of events, this section of events, this section of events. Okay, with that out of the way then, let's talk about how the book of Judges propels the biblical narrative forward. Judges 1:1 sets the stage for the book, but we also need to remember the history that we've covered up until this point. So let me read Judges 1:1 and then do a recap. So Judges 1:1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who will be the first to fight for us against the Canaanites? Okay. So as we can see here, the Canaanites are still present. Israel's still fighting them. And so there's conquest activities still going on. And that's how the book of Judges begins. But what we want to do is remember kind of what God has already said about Israel as a nation and their role in conquering the land. So I've harped on this quite a bit. Exodus 19, specifically verses 3 through 6, is God kind of giving the nation of Israel a big overarching vision for what living in covenant with him looks like. And ultimately, he says, you're going to be my kingdom of priests, and you're going to be a holy nation if you choose to uphold these covenant obligations and live with me in covenant. And the nation of Israel agrees. And then the law, the Mosaic law, flows out of that agreement there in Exodus 19. And so we see the first telling of the law from Exodus 20, basically through the end of Leviticus, and there are some sections in the book of Numbers. And then we have a new generation that hears the law in the book of Deuteronomy. And so that's actually Moses retelling Israel's history and large swaths of the law to this new generation, which is the generation that's going to actually enter into the promised land. So then at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses dies, Joshua takes over for Moses. And Joshua is the one who actually leads the nation of Israel across the Jordan River. Let me pull up my atlas. So in Deuteronomy, they are camped out in this region, west of the Jordan River. The Jordan River is right here between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. And so in Deuteronomy, they're camped out here. Joshua is the one who actually leads them across into the promised land. And then this is the map of the 12 tribes, all of their allotments of land. So Joshua pushes in and he moves north and he moves south and he conquers the land. But it's not entirely conquered. And that's what we want to pick up with for Judges. So the land is partially conquered, it's not entirely conquered, and we want to know what God has said about Israel conquering the land, because that is what plays into the book of Judges and why we have this up and down roller coaster throughout the book. And so there are a few passages we need to look at. And I'm actually not going to turn to all of them because I've bullet pointed, instead of reading all the passages, I've bullet pointed it. But the first passage we need to understand is Exodus 23, 27 through 33. Exodus 23, 27 through 33. And God tells Israel that he will go before Israel and secure the victory in the promised land. God will not drive out all the nations. He will not drive them out all at once. He's actually going to drive them out in stages, because if they were all driven out at once, then Israel actually wouldn't be able to fill the land and it would be overrun by wild animals and vegetation. And so God says, yeah, I'm not actually going to drive everybody out at once. And then he tells the people, since I'm not driving them all out at once, do not make a covenant with these people. You need to remain completely separate from the Canaanites. Do not make a covenant with them. And then fourth and finally for this passage, God says that these native Canaanites shall not dwell in your land, and you shall not serve their gods. So God's going to go before them and secure the victory. He's not going to drive out the Canaanites all at once. In the meantime, the Israelites are not supposed to make a covenant with them, and they are not supposed to allow the Canaanites to dwell in their land long term, and they certainly are not supposed to embrace the Canaanites' gods. Okay, if you already know a little bit about the book of Judges, you can see, yikes. But the second passage that we have to examine is Deuteronomy 7. So this is in the second telling of the law. And again, this sets up the stage for why Judges is the way that it is. Deuteronomy 7. Again, I've got bullet points here. I've got 9 of them. And this is the entire chapter of Deuteronomy 7. It's a brilliant chapter. So God says, he tells the Israelites to completely destroy the nations of the land. So it's supposed to be a complete conquest. Tells the Israelites not to intermarry with the Canaanites. They are to tear down the Canaanites' religious figures. The Lord God, Yahweh, has chosen the nation of Israel. He chose them, and so he's going to be with them. Israel is to know that Yahweh is faithful to the covenant, and that means both faithful to the blessings that he's promised, should Israel uphold the covenant obligations, and faithful to the curses that he's promised, should Israel rebel against the covenant obligations. That's really important. 6, God explains what blessing looks like if Israel's faithful to the covenant obligations. 7th, God says, do not pity these nations that you're going in to conquer, and do not follow their gods. Because remember, God actually promised this to Abraham back in Genesis 12, 13, 15, and 17, that his descendants are actually going, when they conquer that land, it's going to also serve as God's judgment against the inhabitants of that land. So Israel is not to pity these nations. Number 8, if Israel fears the nations, they need to remember that Yahweh will drive them out. Because if he's willing to drive out the native inhabitants, then he's also willing to drive out his chosen people. So that's kind of something that foreshadows to the future. But if he does drive Israel out due to their unfaithfulness, he's not actually going to drive them out all at once either. So we see this kind of nuanced position that God takes, both with conquering the Canaanites, he's not driving them all out at once, but then also, should Israel be disobedient, he's not going to drive them all out at once either. And then number 9, do not covet the Canaanites' things, and keep yourselves completely separate from them. So when Israel comes in, they're not supposed to have anything to do with the Canaanites. The Canaanites aren't going to be driven out all at once, but Israel is supposed to stand firm in their covenant obligations and being faithful to that covenant to Yahweh. They're not supposed to covet the nations. They're not supposed to embrace any of their practices, nothing like that. So that's Deuteronomy 7. The third one that we have to look at is Joshua 13. And so Joshua 13 is kind of like, Joshua kind of is in two parts. The first 12 chapters you have the conquest, and then kind of the second 12 chapters of Joshua you have the tribal allotments. So the second 12 chapters is actually where Joshua is describing these plots of land that each tribe is going to inherit. And so Joshua 13, there are two other things that are really important for the book of Judges. One, much of the land still needs to be possessed. So again, the conquest is incomplete. 2, Yahweh is going to drive out the Canaanites, and Joshua is to distribute the land. Okay? And for the most part, Joshua is pretty faithful with that. But Joshua doesn't live forever. And so at the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua dies. And now, for the first time in Israel's history since the Exodus, they do not have a central leader. So when they came out of Exodus, or when they came out of Egypt, they had Moses. For 40 years in the wilderness, they had Moses. When Moses died, they had Joshua, and he led the conquest. Now that Joshua's died, now kind of the 12 tribes are on their own because they've been given their land to an extent, and they are expected to uphold these covenant obligations, tribe by tribe. They don't have a centralized leader. And so that's really important for when we come into Judges 1:1, because we see here, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who will be the first to fight for us against the Canaanites? The conquest is incomplete. Yahweh's going to secure the victory. Israel has to be faithful. Those are kind of the three main theses of Exodus 23, Deuteronomy 7, and Joshua 13 that I just mentioned before. So it's really important for then understanding the rest of the book of Judges. So when we look at this first stage in the book of Judges, the first 3 chapters, we have this incomplete conquest, and God actually then assesses Israel's progress in this conquest. So as we move through chapter 1, it kind of looks like things are going well, but then we get midway through Judges 1, and let me see if I can find it. Okay, so now we see here these section headings in the CSB. Benjamin's failure. At the same time, the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. The Jebusites have lived among the Benjaminites in Jerusalem to this day. Well, that's not good, right? Because remember, Yahweh's going to drive them out, Israel's supposed to be faithful. They're not supposed to live alongside them. They're not supposed to have anything to do with them. But at the same time, the nations of the land aren't going to be all driven out at once. So it's this weird, nuanced dichotomy. And then we see some success with the house of Joseph. So that's Ephraim and Manasseh. But then we have the failure of the other tribes. So Manasseh failed to take possession of Beth-shean and Tanakh. And so Ephraim also failed at times. Zebulun failed. Asher failed. Naphtali failed. The Amorites forced the Danites into the hill country and did not allow them to go down into the valley. The Amorites were determined to stay in Harhares Ajalon and Shalbim. I'm not very great at pronouncing some of these. Shalbim. When the house of Joseph got the upper hand, the Amorites were made to serve as forced labor. The territory of the Amorites extended from the Scorpion's Ascent, that is, from Selah upward. Okay, so we see here at the end of chapter 1 that the conquest is incomplete and the tribes have failed to allow Yahweh to drive out the inhabitants of the land. The reason why I say it that way is because, as we saw through Numbers and Joshua, when Israel is faithful to what Yahweh tells them to do, he secures the victory. When they're unfaithful, Israel's defeated. So it's not like Yahweh is dependent. It's not like his arm is too weak and he's dependent on Israel in order to secure a victory. He's abiding by the covenant, the terms that Israel has agreed to. So now we get down into chapter 2, and here we see the section heading of the pattern of sin and judgment. And so here, the first 5 verses of chapter 2 are really important because we see God's assessment of Israel's conquest. So I want to read this because, again, this kind of sets everything else up. So the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land I had promised to your ancestors. I also said, I will never break my covenant with you. You are not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You are to tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What have you done? Therefore, I now say, I will not drive out these people before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a trap for you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these words to all the Israelites, the people wept loudly. So they named that place Bochim, and offered sacrifices there to the Lord. So we have this assessment, right? God's assessment for Israel's either obedience or disobedience in following him and doing what he's told them to do. And we can see it is a negative assessment, and there's a consequence. It says, since you have failed in this, since you have not obeyed me, therefore I say I will not drive out these people before you, and they will be a thorn and a snare and a trap for you. And that really sets up the rest of this book, because as we read through, we see the surrounding nations conquer Israel. They oppress them. Eventually the people grow weary and they cry out to Yahweh. Yahweh raises up a judge, right, a leader, who does a bunch of mighty feats with the help of the Lord, and he delivers the people from the surrounding nations. And then there's a period of prosperity and faithfulness and blessing in the land, and then they go back into apostasy and unfaithfulness. And so that's really like the rest from chapter 3 through 16. That's what the book of Judges is telling us. It's telling this sequence of failure and being conquered, and then crying out to the Lord, being delivered and having blessing, and then failure and conquer, and it's just this roller coaster back and forth. And so that is what we read in those intermediate chapters. And so we also see, when we look at that segment of this book in its entirety, kind of as a whole, we see Yahweh's faithfulness to the covenant. If you're faithful, this is what happens. If you're unfaithful, then this is what happens. And so we can see that as a whole when we look over those middle chapters of Judges. Let me see. I've got some notes here, so I'm looking. So when we get to the end of the book, let me just cover chapters 17 through 21 quickly, because that highlights the depravity of Israel. We see some really odd stories, like idolatry among the Danites, and so like they're running around just kind of marauding and conquering. And then we have Micah's idolatry, and he has a priest in his house, and like we see weird things going on there. And then we have the Levite and his concubine, which if you go to Judges 19, I think it is. I think it's chapter 19. Let me get to 19. Yeah. So Judges 19 almost reads verbatim to Genesis 19, which is the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's a really odd parallel that reveals quite a bit about the depravity of Israel at this time. And then the tribe of Benjamin goes into civil war with the rest of Israel, and there's this whole big civil war, and then the aftermath of that, and you finish reading Judges 17 through 21, and you just kind of wonder what the heck happened. Like, what did I just read? And again, these chapters are describing the depravity that's going on, so we can, as the reader, we can understand, wow, the nation of Israel has fallen off the rails, and ultimately we're driven to the conclusion that the book of Judges really wants us to get to is that Israel has completely failed to be God's kingdom of priests and holy nation. That goes back to Exodus 19. So when we get to the end of Judges, we realize this has been a complete failure in almost every respect. They didn't conquer the land. They weren't faithful. They ended up being persuaded by the other nations and the other nations' religions, and they committed idolatry. And ultimately, now the nation doesn't really look a whole lot different from the surrounding nations that they were supposed to conquer. And so it's really devastating when we get to the end of this book, because we enter the book with hope, or at least some hopeful anticipation, and now we're like, oh my word, look at what has happened. And the last verse of the book is very telling. So Judges 21:25 is kind of a thesis statement for the entire book, kind of captures everything that the author wants us to realize. And it is, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. Or some translations say everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so we see a complete disregard for Yahweh's covenant and the law, and everyone's just doing what they think is permissible. And part of that is because there's no central leader for the nation, and that sets us up very perfectly for where we're going next. So the next book in the Christian Bible, at least the Christian, Protestant Bible, is Ruth, which we're going to talk about here shortly. But Judges actually kind of is better setting us up for 1 Samuel. And so I'm really excited to talk about 1 Samuel. It's one of my favorite books. And Judges really launches us into 1 Samuel, even though Ruth is in between them. So make sure you check out the video on Ruth that's coming up, because that's going to explain kind of how Ruth is situated between these two books. And then more specifically, the video on Samuel, because that's going to pick up where we left off in Judges. But ultimately, the book of Judges is kind of an ancient tragedy in a sense, where there's hope at the beginning, but then it goes downhill. And we're left at the end recognizing that this nation has failed to be Yahweh's nation of priests and his holy nation. And we recognize that we need some type of figure, leader, that's going to pull the nation together and pull everybody into unity, and then direct them vertically towards Yahweh, and then also horizontally towards each other, and as being an example to the nations surrounding them, as opposed to embracing the customs of the nations surrounding them. So that is the book of Judges, how it links with what came before it, how it's setting us up for what comes next. And so stay tuned for the books of Ruth and for Samuel. And until then, happy Bibling.